Fair Play, a novel by Pete Fisher. Chapter 32. Big Time. It was one of those boring birthday parties. Martin wondered why he'd bothered to come. The clique of young German friends he'd latched onto when he first arrived had moved on now. Back then, they'd gone out every weekend together to get shit-faced. Now they all had proper jobs and proper relationships. They seemed to have had less and less time for each other. It had got to the point now where they only met at each other's birthday parties. Martin remembered why he'd come. There was a girl at the party he really liked. He'd fancied her ever since he'd first set eyes on her, about 4 years before. Her name was Cindy. She was from Berlin, a tough, no-nonsense big city girl. She'd come to Cologne to work for a music TV company. Cindy was blonde, and you could have said voluptuous. She had eyes you could swim in, and the cutest cheeks ever. Martin let on to Cindy that he had a new tape of his home studio stuff. She suggested they go into the kitchen to listen to it on the ghetto blaster. Cindy really liked what she heard. She complimented Martin. "Das klingt echt gut. You get a great sound." Martin had been listening to dub reggae a lot with Daisy. It had rubbed off on his own atmospheric instrumentals. The sound also harked back to his gigs with Quicksand. Cindy smiled as Martin's demo tape came to an end. A tall, well-built young man with Celtic flame tattoos up his muscular arms came into the kitchen. "Hi, Marcus." "Na, Cindy." He had shortish fair hair and looked early 20s. He wore a grunge band t-shirt and long shorts. He had a chunky chain hanging down from his belt loop. Martin thought he looked a bit menacing at first. He turned out to be a gentle giant. "Hi, ich bin der Markus. Du bist der Martin, richtig?" Martin wondered how Marcus knew who he was. Marcus explained. "I think you're English, yes? Your friends tell me you play great guitar. You play in a reggae band in England." Martin nodded again. He wondered what else he'd heard. "Yeah, I did play in a reggae band for a little while, that's right. I'm the tour manager for a reggae singer from Germany. His band must have a guitarist. It's urgent. They have very big concerts this summer. Maybe you're interested?" "Oh, what kind of gigs?" "Festivals, open air, some on TV." Martin knew that meant tens of thousands in the crowd. He gulped. This was what he'd always wanted. He'd never thought it would really happen. It sounded almost too good to be true. "Do you think you could do it? They need someone soon." Martin grinned. "Yeah, I'd love to." Martin honestly had no idea if he was up to it, but it would be stupid to turn it down. "I give you the drummer's phone number. You meet with the band and see if you like it." Marcus scribbled the name and number down. Martin wrote his own on another piece of paper and handed it to Marcus. Cindy grinned. "Hey, rock star." Marcus laughed. He was obviously pleased. Martin wondered if it was fate or serendipity. The freeloaders had a practice room deep in the bowels of a red brick industrial building in the southernmost part of Cologne. It also housed a couple of recording studios. Martin drove slowly into the cobbled courtyard. There was a little lawn in the middle with an ornamental fountain. He backed up to the loading bay. Their drummer, Stan, was waiting when Martin pulled in, staring at his mobile phone. Stan looked up, waved, and came down to the car. After a brief greeting and handshake, he helped Martin carry his amp and speaker into the lift. Down in the sub-basement, the freeloaders had their gear set up in the round. Stan's kit was in the far corner. It was an electronic setup with its own mixing desk hooked up to the PA system. The keyboards were stacked up in the corner next to it. The bass rig was on the hi-hat side of the kit. While Martin set up in the middle, Stan briefed him on what he might expect. They backed a reggae singer called Frankie. They'd worked for him for 2 years, since he'd got his record deal. His first album had come out early the previous year. They'd done around 150 shows since then. He was currently in Jamaica recording the next album using Jamaican session players. He'd be back for rehearsals in about a month's time. Right on cue, Sean, the bassist, and Roger, the keyboarder, showed up. Marcus followed close behind, carrying a case of beer. They all said hi and shook hands. Then the 3 regular freeloaders kicked into one of their rhythms. It was loud. It was incredibly tight. They could switch into different syncopations and tempos with just a nod or a shout. Martin joined in. Roger yelled the chord changes. Martin fitted in well, quickly finding the feel and groove. Stan or Roger nodded at him now and then, simply shouting solo. He turned up the volume and let it flow, improvising on the spot. Martin glanced up briefly. There were grins all round. They liked it. They stopped and took a beer break. Marcus opened a bottle and passed it to him with a smile. Ich mag den Marshall amp. Klingt geil. Martin loved his Marshall and thought it sounded great too. He grabbed the beer gratefully. Thirsty work. It was hot in there, but he was having fun. Sean was very taken with Martin's guitar and asked if he could have a go. Martin handed it over. Sean's eyes lit up. His eyebrows rose as he put the strap over his shoulder. It weighed a ton. Martin asked if it was cool to roll a joint. The others laughed and said, "No, we'll call the police." They played for about 2 hours altogether. Stan told Martin he had to be able to play everything perfectly, even after being woken from a deep sleep at 3 a.m. The freeloaders had a reputation as one of the tightest outfits in Europe. They didn't want to lose it. Stan also told Martin to remember they were just hired hands, circus horses. If Frankie decided they weren't good enough, he'd just get another band. There were no contracts. The money was paid out after the gig, cash, no questions. No one had said how much. Martin didn't ask. They said he could leave his gear there, but they never actually told him he got the job. Martin stood stage left. At the end of the song, he lifted his guitar strap over his head and put his heavy Les Paul down on the stand behind him. The rest of the band left the stage. Frankie announced the next song. Martin picked up his electro-acoustic guitar and plugged it in. A loud clack resounded through the enormous festival PA system. The sound man out front swore. Martin walked over to the drum riser and sat down. He settled the guitar in his lap and cautiously played a couple of chords. They resounded loudly through the stage monitor speakers and the enormous PA system. It sounded like a giant playing a giant guitar. Frankie sat down next to him, holding a spliff. He took a hit and put his arm round Martin's shoulders. He exhaled upwards. The pall of smoke was picked out in the glare of the spotlight. Frankie asked the crowd a frequent question. "How you feeling out there?" An enormous roar went up from what must have been around 30,000 people. The lighting tech swept the crowd with white light. Martin glanced up and saw for the first time that evening just how many people had been out there in the darkness. When the stage lights were on, you could only see the first couple of dozen rows. Now he could see that the natural bowl was packed with people. They stretched right back over the distant brow of the upward slope and over the horizon. Frankie asked the lighting man to dim the lights and the crowd to get out their lighters. The stage was plunged into darkness. Spot on Frankie and Martin. The crowd slowly erupted into an ocean of tiny flames. Martin got goosebumps and felt a shiver run down his spine. It was up to him to start the song. Frankie gave him a name check. Martin Dalgleish on the guitar. The first chords rang out clear and very loud. The PA probably had at least as many watts as there were people. Martin loved that tremendous feeling of power in his hands. The sea of lighters looked like a city of tiny lights. The crowd sang along like a massed choir. Freddie could leave out strategic phrases and they would simply fill the gap. Martin's heart was beating hard with the adrenaline. He had a huge grin of delight. Freddie brought the song to a close. The lighting guy lit up the crowd again. They stood up en masse and cheered. It was sensational. Midnight at the Oasis. The rendezvous with the tour bus was at the blue-lit gas station on the edge of Cologne. In the shop, Martin got himself 3 ice-cold bottles of Beck's, an ice-cold mineral water, 2 packets of king-size cigarette papers and 2 disposable lighters. Then he went next door to the fast food joint and got a double cheeseburger, large fries and a large coffee to go. Martin was on the road. He walked over to the long, sleek, white tour bus. It was parked under the car park's cold, bright lights. He pressed the code into the button panel next to the rear side door. The hydraulic mechanism hissed. The door swung open. He pushed the button inside to close it. Martin walked into the kitchen area and stopped to stash his beer in the fridge. He continued into the lounge. He sat down in a vacant window seat at one of the 4 tables. It was laid out a bit like in the train, but the seats were much more comfortable. Also in the train, you don't have a fuck-off sound system. There were speakers built into the ceiling and a big subwoofer under the floor. They were on their way to one of Germany's most prestigious reggae festivals, deep in the heart of Bavaria, a good 7 hours drive. In theory, the band and entourage could sleep through the journey in the bus's 12 bunks. Some people did. Most of the band spent the first few hours sitting in the lounge, drinking beer, getting stoned and listening to music. Martin was having the time of his life. Frankie and the freeloaders had a tea time slot. They'd spent the afternoon chilling in the shade of a large tree away from the stage. They'd already set their gear up that morning on risers and trolleys behind the black backdrops at the side of the stage. When the band before them had finished, the freeloaders wheeled their gear on and set up for line check. The festival conveyor belt rolled relentlessly on. Line check meant that the band plugged in and each played a bit. The tech would try and balance the sound. Musicians had to get the sound in their monitor speaker they wanted. By shouting and signalling thumb up or down at the monitor tech at the side of the stage, you could get a bit more or less of each instrument. The festival guy did his best, but the freeloaders were hard to please. Sean would get quite aggressive sometimes, like a Jack Russell that wouldn't let go. During all the shouting and waving, a 3-man camera crew from the TV company were getting in the way. Martin had to shoo one away, who stood right between him and the audience. Martin noticed, to his horror, that his amp had no red light. When his turn came to play a bit, there was no sound from his speaker. It must have blown a fuse. He waved frantically at Marcus. He came over and sussed the situation immediately. Marcus ran back across the stage and grabbed a Fender combo amp from behind the backdrops. He wheeled it swiftly over to Martin and plugged it in. The MC announced them. Martin plugged his guitar in and switched the new amp on. He just managed to play the first chord. There were a good 10 or 15,000 people out there in the sunshine. The lake and the mountains behind made a postcard setting. It was quite a sight. Now and then, Martin took a second to look up from his guitar, but he had to concentrate. Frankie had taken to giving Martin a solo in a few of the songs. He always introduced Martin formally, with both names. People, please listen to Mr. Martin Dalgleish on the guitar. Give them some niceness, Martin. Frankie came over and put his arm round Martin's shoulder. The crowd cheered as Martin played the familiar melody. Frankie waved for him to continue. Martin added some ethereal echo repeats to his bluesy riffs for a summer day. Terry would have loved it.